Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. And we are still in our series on prisons. We are talking about prisons today, and specifically today, we're talking about what happens when a disaster comes, a natural disaster, right? We're talking about things like hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, earthquakes, monsoons. What happens to prisoners when these things come? How are we keeping them safe when natural disasters strike? That's the question. And we already know that there's a whole bunch of environmental injustices that occur when disasters come to those who aren't even incarcerated, right? We already know all those issues. We've talked about them, right? Do we need to evacuate? Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? How are we going to evacuate? Do I have the supplies that I need to deal with this storm coming, with this natural disaster that's headed our way? I need water. I need food. I need batteries. I need gas in the car. Do I even have a car? Do I have a way to get to where I'm trying to go? And in my city, how are we dealing with people who are particularly vulnerable to these disasters? How are we dealing with the elderly? What about the unhoused population? What about people in hospitals and other healthcare facilities? What's the plan for them? What's the plan for my neighborhood, right? I'm in an all-Black neighborhood, an immigrant neighborhood, an Hispanic neighborhood. Do the people who make the plans, are they considering us and helping us deal with this disaster? That's what's happening even if you're not incarcerated. It's already hard enough. But just imagine having those same questions and having those same concerns, but you're incarcerated, you're in prison, you're in jail. What happens to you then? What are you going to do when the storm comes? How do you even think about what you can do to keep yourself safe? Is there anything you can do? We're going to talk about all that on this episode. So stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening. So on this episode, we're talking about natural disasters and specifically what happens to prisoners when these disasters come. Now, before we even get into all of that, it's important to know that dealing with natural disasters is already a major environmental justice issue. It's already a big deal, even before you talk about people who are incarcerated. Right? Think about the disparities in infrastructure. So we know that areas that have more trees, more greenery, shrubs, grass, those areas are able to handle hurricanes and tropical storms much more easily than paved, cleared out areas where it's just parking lots, asphalt, and buildings. We already know the differences between the two. And so if you live in an area where there aren't a lot of trees around, there aren't a lot of shrubs around, there's not a lot of grass around, you can expect to experience those disasters much more severely than areas that have those things. And that's just the impact of the hurricane, the impact of the tornado, the impact of the storm. What about flooding? Those things keep the floodwaters from overtaking you as well. Trees, different types of green infrastructure can keep flooding at a minimum. Whereas if you live in a highly paved, highly dense area where there's none of that, the flooding happens faster and it's more severe. So that's already a problem before you talk about prisons. Right? There's differences in resources for the families and for different cities and different areas when it comes to dealing with disasters that are coming your way. We already know that as well. We know that the funding for preparedness, for planning, things like getting buses and transportation to people so they can get out of a neighborhood that's going to be impacted is a problem. We know that trying to find resources, food, water, those kinds of things are difficult to get if you don't have the resources. And so when you're preparing for that storm, when you're preparing for that hurricane to come, do you have what you need? We know there's big disparities in that. And it's not a coincidence that those disparities are usually on the lines of race and on the lines of income. And you might be thinking, well, it's understandable if you don't have enough money to get what you need, you just won't have it. But that's why you have a government, you have officials, you have an emergency management division that steps in to ensure that all the citizens, all the people are safe and protected during these kinds of incidences, these kinds of disasters. Nothing should prevent you or anyone from having what they need to be safe when these things happen. When the governor says it's time to evacuate, you shouldn't have to wonder if you're going to be able to. You should be able to because your local government should be providing the means by which you evacuate if you don't have the means yourself. That's how that works. And that's how that goes. Unfortunately, there's tons of research that shows us that it doesn't happen that way in a lot of our communities. And that's a big problem. And of course, you may have seen a lot of the news stories about what happens after the hurricanes, after the flooding stops and the waters recede. How are the rebuilding efforts done? There's definitely major disparities in what gets rebuilt, how it gets rebuilt, and who gets to come back to their homes and who loses their homes forever and end up with no place to go once the storms are gone, right? You become an environmental refugee because you don't have a place to live and there's nobody rebuilding your neighborhood, your town, your little place where you're from because it's not deemed to be as important as some of the other parts of the cities that we're seeing get rebuilt right away. And so all that happens. Look, we need to do another series on just natural disasters in general and how disproportionate the impacts are when they come. But that's just for the rest of us who are out here trying to make it. What if you're in prison? What happens if you're a prisoner and you see the news or you hear the news that a Category 5 hurricane is coming your way? What do? Because your life is totally different than my life out here in this room recording this podcast. It's totally different. And I would say it's different in at least 3 ways when it comes to dealing with natural disasters. Number 1, as a prisoner, as someone who is incarcerated, you are not making any decisions for yourself about what you will do, what you won't do, what you're going to do when the storm comes. You have no decision-making power whatsoever. It doesn't matter what anybody else says, right? So you could have your governor, your mayors, they're saying we need to evacuate, we need to get out, keep yourself safe. You need to get out as soon as possible. They can say all that stuff if they want to. But you being incarcerated means that you don't get to choose if you leave or not. The officials that run the prisons and the jails will decide for you if you are able to be evacuated and brought to safety. I mean, you can't just get up and go because the governor said to evacuate. We got to go to someplace safer. We got to go to higher ground like he said, like she said on the news. You have to wait and see if the officials in your prison will allow that and evacuate you, no matter how dangerous they say it's going to be. You have no choice. What about the hurricane preparedness plan, right? So they encourage everyone to have a plan for when a hurricane comes and to be ready and to listen to your local officials and to do all the things that will keep you safe when a disaster strikes. We're encouraged to do that, right? You can go on the CDC's website. We'll have a link in the description. There's a nice, thorough, comprehensive set of instructions on what to do when this disaster comes. You can't develop one for yourself if you're in prison. You can't craft and plan and execute a hurricane preparedness plan. You have no option in that regard. Your officials who run your prison will have to do that. Hopefully they even have one. I wonder if they even have one that they go by, because there's been studies and research that's been done in lots of different places all around the country where prison officials, corrections facilities do not have a hurricane preparedness plan, even though they've experienced hurricanes in the past. There's no plan for what to do. There's no plan for how to manage the people who are being held at those facilities. There's no plan at all. So what are you going to do? Right? What is the agreed upon approach to managing everything when this storm comes? Do you even get to contribute to the plan at all? Do you get to say, hey, I think we should consider doing some of these things to keep ourselves safe? Of course not. Not when you're a prisoner. You don't have any decision-making power, authority, influence whatsoever. It doesn't matter, because unless the people at the top decide for you, nothing will happen on your behalf. It just won't happen. And then if you're stuck in prison because they didn't want to evacuate, you're left with the impacts. You're left with the fallout. And you have no ability to deal with those on your own because you have no access to the resources that you would need to weather a storm, right? If the electricity goes out, you're without electricity. If the water stops flowing, you're just without water. The AC goes out. I mean, if your prison even has AC, we talked about that last time. A lot of these prisons don't. But if you did and it goes out, you're stuck without air conditioning. That's just the way it's going to be. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. You're just there, and you can't decide for yourself what you can do to deal with an impending hurricane on the way. So that's the first thing. You make no decisions for yourself. The second thing is you're not able to get the supplies that you need to weather the storm. So out here, if we choose to stay in our home, stay in the apartment, and not evacuate, that's fine. We go to the store, you get a bunch of bottles of water, you get batteries, you get canned foods, you get emergency supplies, first aid kits, all those things, because you know that when this storm passes through, you may need some of those things to deal with the impacts. But you can't do that if you're a prisoner. You can't go to the store and stock up your living area with these supplies when this storm comes. You don't have that option. You're completely relying on the people who are running the prison to have those things for you. And that's all you're going to have. So if there's no water because the faucets don't work, you'll be getting whatever they give you for water and how much of it they want to give you for water. That's all you get. If the food stops coming because people can't bring it in, or you can't prepare it because the electricity's out, you'll be eating whatever they give you. You have no choice in the matter. And I promise you, as the storm passes through your area, the conditions in the prison will get worse, especially if the power goes out. It was hot before, it'll get even hotter. The water was bad before, it'll get worse if you get any at all. You'll have no contact with anyone. You won't have the basic necessities because it won't be available. And look, these things were already problems in prisons. They were already issues. We already know about that. In the previous episodes, we talked about heat. We talked about water. Prisoners are a forgotten environmental justice community. I've already said that, but we need to repeat it again. They are forgotten. And when disasters come, that's when you see just how forgotten they are and just how much need is there that they're just not having access to. And it only gets worse when the storms come. It only gets worse when these disasters hit. You see the problems magnify during these events. And the person who is in the prison, who is in the jail, has to rely on the people who are running those facilities to provide what is needed. And if they weren't doing it before the storm came, I have very little faith that they would do it during the storm or after the storm. It's just hard to believe that they would come through like that in the middle of a disaster. And so you're not able to get what you need to weather the storm. So 1, you're not making any decisions for yourself. 2, you can't get the supplies that you need. And the third thing that I know happens during these disasters is that you cannot get the emergency medical care you need during these storms. So if you're in prison, you're in jail, you have any kind of medical issue, any kind of medical concern, these disasters can and will make those things worse. And they keep you from getting the help that you need. You need continuous care and assistance, and disasters will disrupt that. And I doubt that the people running your prison will work hard to ensure that you continue to have it, because it was already hard enough to get it from the beginning when you're in there. And now that a hurricane's come, a tornado has come, a tropical storm has come, an earthquake happened, all of those ways of getting that have been disrupted, and it's slow getting it back. Right? I mean, it's been well documented that access to medical care and specialized personnel are often cut off during natural disasters. And if you're female, if you're pregnant, if you have any other kind of ongoing chronic conditions, having these disruptions can be fatal. They can cause tremendous harm and tremendous damage. You can't afford to not have that medical care. You can't afford to try to continue a pregnancy without the care that you need for you and for your child. You can't continue to have a chronic illness and lose access to your medicine, access to the treatments, access to all the medical care that goes into ensuring that you can continue to live at least a somewhat healthy life while you're incarcerated. These disruptions can be extremely, extremely harmful. And what if the disaster is a disease outbreak, right? We saw this with COVID-19. COVID-19 spread so fast through all the prisons, and it was already hard enough to contain it out here. It was just horrific in the prisons, horrific in those detention facilities. And we were able to see with extreme clarity that the prison officials were completely incapable of keeping the prison population safe when the pandemic began. Even though they have complete control over the facility, they have complete autonomy in how they confront the disease when it broke out, they were even unable to keep the prisoners safe, right? We've been fighting out here for masks and to take vaccines and to do all this other stuff to try to keep COVID from spreading. People in prison don't even have choices like that. The prison officials can do what they want to do, and yet they couldn't contain, minimize the spread and the death that occurred because of COVID-19. And it was just a horrific scene. It was horrific to see just how bad it got in the prisons. And so think about that. Think about that for a second. You're a prisoner. You know a hurricane's coming. We all do. We all do. We see the news. We hear the news. You see the clouds coming. You see it getting darker in the middle of the day. You know it's going to be a horrible storm. You can't make any decisions about what you do, about how you prepare for that hurricane to come. You can't get supplies you need so that you know you have to weather a storm. You can't do it. And if you need medical care during the storm, it's not going to be available. You're going to be the last person that people think about when it's time to figure out who gets aid and who gets support from medical professionals. It's just a tragic, horrible, inconceivable way of living when you know that disasters are coming. And so what can we do about that? What can we do? We're listening to this. We probably knew this somewhat already, but we're hearing more and more about it. What can we do? And so this is usually the part where I talk about all the things we could do. We can get together and make a difference. This is how we can do it. We can petition these people. We can fight for this kind of change. We can do these kind of different things. And, we have a way of confronting these issues. But we just got to be honest about a few things. Just have to be honest. First of all, everybody already knows what to do. Everybody already knows what needs to happen, right? I get the same notifications that you get, that the prison officials get, that the prisoners get. We all know what to do when a hurricane's coming. We all know what to do when the storm is coming. We know how to prepare. We know how to stock up and what to purchase and what we need. And I can promise you the people running the prisons have the same information. Actually, they probably have better information. They get it directly from the government because they're in a government agency as well. They have the same information that the governor has, that the emergency managers have. They know all these things, right? They know all this stuff. There's nothing to tell them or to ask them that they don't know about already. They know all this stuff. And number two, they have access to all the resources. They're the ones that can go and get what's needed. They can get the food that's needed, the water, the medicine, the personnel. They have access to whatever is needed to keep people safe during a storm. They have all of that. And during most storms, if it's bad enough and the governor declares a state of emergency, that gets even more resources coming into the state, coming into the areas where that storm is going to hit. And so if your prison, your jail is in that zone, in that area where the storm is coming, you should be getting additional resources to prepare for the impact of that storm. And so we know the resources will be there. They're available. And there's no resistance from the prison population. Nobody's going to be in jail saying, no, I want to stay here when the storm comes. They'll be more than happy to do whatever is necessary to be safe. They're waiting for you, who runs the prison, to make a decision and to do it and to go. What are we doing? And so ultimately, it's not about us doing anything except telling people that we need to remember what I said in the first episode of this series, that prisoners are people. That's what it comes down to. It's all about having care and empathy and compassion for people who are in harm's way. people who are in the eye of the storm, very literally, in the eye of the storm. What are we going to do for them to keep them safe? That's what it comes down to. We need to look at our incarcerated population differently than we have. They're not just animals locked in a cage, and they're not just these unredeemable people that we can just discard from society. They're real people, and we need to make sure we treat them like that and make sure they have what they need to be safe when a disaster comes. That's what we have to do. Because I can promise you this much. The people running the prison, the staff there, the directors and the wardens and the correctional officers, they're making sure that their family is safe, that their friends are safe, that they have what they need when the storm's coming. They have all the resources, they have all the information, they share it, disseminate it. The people that they know are well protected and safe during these disasters, these natural disasters, which are only going to get more and more frequent because of climate change. We have to remember that these aren't just random events that occur every now and then. We're seeing a steady pattern of increasing instances of strong hurricanes, major tornadoes, wildfires that won't end, earthquakes, monsoons happening all over the world because of climate change, because of the way that we're managing our environmental resources. That is happening. And as a result, we're seeing these things happen more and more. And so we need to make sure we care about the people who are vulnerable. There aren't too many people that are more vulnerable than a prison population that's devoid of any rights, devoid of any autonomy, devoid of any ability to decide what happens when a storm comes. We just have to think about them differently. We have to think differently. And you know what? Along with that, we need to reduce our population, our prison population. We need to bring those numbers down, right? I mean, I know this is not a criminal justice podcast and this is not a legal affairs show, but still, I know there are ways to reduce the number of people who are in prison. We don't need so many people in prison. There's better ways to do public safety, better ways to deal with mental illness, better ways to deal with those who are struggling with drug and alcohol dependency than to lock them all up. And if we could reduce the population, it could potentially make it easier for people to manage the prisons when there's an event that happens, right? When something comes and there's fewer people, there's less that you need to do because there's fewer people to manage, right? I mean, we all know that when it comes to prisoners and natural disasters, there's no special unknown way of ensuring their safety. We have to try to figure it out and try to learn more. We don't need any of that. We just need to get them what they need, and we just need to treat them like human beings, how we would treat anybody else who we knew was in a potentially disastrous situation. That's it. Nothing special. You see someone in prison, you see someone incarcerated. They're a person just like you. What do they need? What should we give them to help them survive and make it through the storm? Just get them that, and you'll be fine. You don't have to do anything special, anything off the wall. You just treat them like human beings because that's what they are. People who are incarcerated are people just like us, and they need the exact same things that we need. And so we should just get them what they need instead of leaving them to suffer the impacts of these increasingly strong and dangerous natural disasters. Let's just do that. Let's treat our incarcerated friends and neighbors and family members and people in society like human beings. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.